Good evening. I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now live stream series, where we bring you experts from the UW community talking about timely and important topics. Global tensions are high as Russian forces continue to press with greater intensity into Ukraine. What is Vladimir Putin's near-term objective in Ukraine and his longer-term strategy in the region? What's the likelihood of success at this point? Will the Zelensky government survive? And have the US and NATO responses been adequate to this point? How and when will this end? Joining us to offer their observations this evening are three experts from the UW Political Science Department. Yoshiko Herrera is a professor of comparative politics and international relations. Andrew Kydd is a professor of political science and is affiliated with the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. And Jessica Weeks is a professor of political science and the H. Douglas Weaver Chair in Diplomacy and International Relations. We're grateful to have all of them here with us tonight. And our first speaker this evening will be Professor Yoshiko Herrera. Her research on Russian politics, nationalism, identity, and ethnic politics, political economy and state statistics, and international norms has been published by Cambridge University Press, Cornell University Press, Perspectives on Politics, Comparative Politics, and other leading journals. At UW-Madison, she teaches courses on comparative politics, social identity, and post-communist politics. Before arriving in Madison in 2007, Herrera was the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard University. She's also a former director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. Professor Herrera, thanks for joining us this evening, and we appreciate you leading off our discussion tonight.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Okay, well, let's get started. I wanted to start the conversation off by discussing a little bit of the historical context for this conflict. And there's some important things to understand in the complexity of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship, and so I'm going to try to highlight some of those. I think the first thing that is important is that Russia and Ukraine have a very long shared history. The ancient area known as Kievan Rus goes back to the 9th century. There's a shared cultural heritage, shared religion, etc., going back centuries. An important development in that relationship, however, is the development of the Russian Empire. And this creates a power asymmetry between the Russian ethnic Russians and the Russian elite and the Ukrainians, which many people would say is part of the development of Ukrainian consciousness and the Ukrainian nation and a divergence between Russian and Ukrainian people, let's say starting in the 17th century. But nevertheless, among ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, this is not a case of historic hostilities. This is a case of people with similar background living in a similar space for a long time. There's many people with shared relatives. Ukrainians are the largest ethnic group within the Russian Federation, and ethnic Russians are the largest ethnic non-Ukrainian ethnic group in Ukraine today. Many people speak both languages in Ukraine, so there's a lot that they share in common. However, there's some important breaks in the relationship, and one is that in the Soviet Union, which was comprised of 15 republics, Ukraine was one of those republics. And there was a famine caused by the policies of Joseph Stalin in the 1930s during collectivization, which led to what Ukrainians consider a genocide. They call it the Holodomor, and that is a critical event in the identity narratives of Ukrainians. So this is an important piece that makes Ukrainians especially anti-Soviet. Not necessarily anti-ethnic Russian, but certainly very against a re-Sovietization or any imposition of a Russian or Soviet state over Ukraine. Ukraine gained its independence in 1991, as did the other 15 Soviet socialist republics. But Vladimir Putin, who was a KGB officer before he became president, He never fully accepted the sovereignty of the 15 Soviet states. He always has argued for a so-called sphere of influence over the region. And he's shown his interest in exercising that power in different places, with Russian troops currently stationed in Moldova and in Georgia since 2008. In some ways, I think it's fair to say that Putin sees Ukrainians not as just an ethnic other, but more as apostate Russians, that is Russians who are doing the wrong thing and need to be brought back into the fold. Why is Russia so concerned about Ukraine? Why did it come up as such an important part of um, Russia's security concerns, according to Putin? I think there's a couple of reasons that people need to think about. The first is that Ukraine has had two successful social revolutions. That is, people rising up and kicking out a pro-Russian government. Viktor Yanukovych actually was involved in both of those revolutions, first in 2004, but he came back to power first as prime minister and then as president, and was finally ousted again in 2014. This idea of a revolution is extremely dangerous for Putin. That's something he fears in his own country, and he certainly doesn't like the example of a successful one in Ukraine. In addition, democracy is a threat to Putin's rule in Russia because he's absolutely against Russia moving any way towards democracy. During the course of his rule over the last 20 plus years, he has consolidated authoritarianism and increasingly used violence against the population to remain in power. So the threat of Ukraine, democracy, their revolutionary example, and the fact that Ukraine was moving further and further westward was a particular threat to Putin. Nevertheless, why did he do it? This picture that you can see is of one of the pictures of Putin at the long table. This is sort of a strange and new development in Russian politics where he's physically isolated from his advisors. That's him meeting with his economic advisors. You can hardly see them in the background on the day that the ruble is collapsing. But why did he invade? I think that there are four things I want to highlight. The first is that Putin has been pushing these humiliation narratives about the 1990s almost since he came to power, saying that Russia was taken advantage of by the West, that they were treated disrespectfully, and that Russia, as it's become richer and more powerful, needs to assert itself and redress some of this humiliation. So the NATO expansion concept, I think, has to be seen in this way, that it's not just an objective security threat from NATO, but NATO expansion is part of this humiliation of the 1990s, which really bothers Putin. Another thing is his imperial ambitions. As I said before, he doesn't respect the sovereignty of Ukraine and the democracy threat. But also, Putin was very much, I think, overconfident and miscalculated what was going on. Why was he overconfident? He's had a series of military victories where he has used violence against his enemies and essentially gotten away with it. He sort of made a name for himself in the early 2000s by prosecuting a very brutal war against Chechnya, a separatist republic within Russia. Later in Georgia, he moved in troops into Georgia in 2008. He took Crimea in 2014. He killed a lot of civilians in intervening in Syria in 2015. And he's tried to assassinate his rivals with the poisonings in Europe, and also his main rival, Alexei Navalny, is currently in jail and actually in the middle of a show trial right now. So, and he also had tried to assassinate Navalny last year. So Putin, I think, thought he could get away with this, these brazen acts of violence against states or individuals who disagree with him. He also expected the international reaction this time to be similar to in the past, which was not particularly strong. And going back again to his view of Ukraine, he just simply did not believe that Ukrainians would stand up and resist. Okay, so what can we look to next? Unfortunately, and I think the next two speakers will speak to this point, we probably are likely to see much more violence before this ends. But I think on a more positive note, there's been an unprecedented and strong and unified international reaction. Within Russia, there are a lot of protests, but thousands of people have been arrested. A prominent independent radio station and TV station were taken off the air today. So definitely they are planning to crack down. And although there have been a lot of celebrities who come out against the war, not a single government minister in Putin's government has resigned over this war. So I think it's a sort of wait and see how this plays out in Russia. But the damage to the Russian economy is already severe and likely to continue. So that has been a cornerstone of Putin's rule, a stable economic system and economic growth. And so I think the economic disruption possibly could put much more pressure on his regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Herrera, for kicking us off tonight. That's great grounding for the rest of our program and for our audience for their Q&A. Our next speaker tonight is Professor Andrew Kydd, who, like Professor Herrera, is also an affiliate of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. His research interests center on game-theoretic analyses of international security issues, such as weapons proliferation, terrorism, trust, and conflict resolution. He's published articles in the American Political Science Review, International Organization, World Politics, and International Security, among other journals. His book, Trust and Mistrust in International Relations, was published in 2005 by Princeton University Press and won the 2006 Conflict Processes Best Book Award. Prior to joining UW-Madison in 2007, Kydd taught at the University of California, Riverside and Harvard University. Professor Kydd, thanks for joining us. We look forward to your observations on the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thanks very much for inviting me. Great to be here. So I'll just have a couple of slides and then a couple of remarks. I think Professor Herrera just did a great job of laying out the causes of the war. I would just divide them into sort of two bins. One is Putin's worldview and the other is Western policy. And I think she just did a good job of summarizing Putin's worldview there. He views the 1991 breakup of the Soviet Union as a disaster that was caused by weak Russian leaders that squandered the legacy of both the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire previous to that. Views Ukrainians and Belarusians as Russians, not as distinct peoples, not as deserving of their own states, people who all belong in a single state ruled from Moscow. And I think he always gave evidence of believing that, but people tended not to take it seriously or thought this was sort of a pie in the sky sort of goal, which wouldn't actually cause him to do anything real, like invade another country. But we've seen that in the current circumstances, he's decided to try to bring that to fruition. And then there's a big debate about the role of Western policy, which we can touch on to the extent that people want, having to do with both NATO expansion and European Union expansion. Part of Putin's propaganda has been that this is brought on by NATO expansion, which is encircling Russia, threatening Russia, and so Russia is defending itself from that hostile expansion by the US, by the European countries, into the countries which used to form the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire, in particular the Baltic states, who were admitted to NATO previously, and now since 2008, when NATO talked about the possibility of letting Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, he's been especially concerned about that. And Ukraine has really been the kind of the jewel in the crown, the big concern for him, the biggest red line which he didn't want others to cross. But the problem is, of course, excuse me, that the countries involved all wanted to join NATO. They wanted to join the EU as well. As soon as the Warsaw Pact broke up, well, as soon as the Soviet Union essentially allowed the Eastern European countries to go their own way, they all overthrew their communist regimes and left the Warsaw Pact and wanted to sign up with NATO, wanted to sign up with the European Union in an effort to get out from Moscow's domination. And so you had this strong demand side from a lot of these Eastern European states including the Baltic states. And NATO, Ukraine itself was more on the fence about this, but was sort of leaning more in the European direction more recently because of the recent elections there, which elected sort of more pro-Western elites, including the Color Revolution and the Maidan Revolution in 1914. So we've seen a lot of demand in the Eastern European states, including Ukraine, to move towards the West, to which NATO and the European Union is responding to some extent. We've also seen some intervention on the part of the United States, or certainly support for the Maidan Revolution, which the Russians point to as well. So there is certainly a role there. On the other hand, it's not, as Putin would characterize it, some sort of imperialistic expansion by the United States to dominate regions and extend its sphere of influence. It's really sort of responding to a call from the states in the region to escape Russian domination, which they've lived with for so long. Maybe just a word or two about where the conflict stands now. I just put a map up here. We have three sort of main conflict zones at the present. The northern region, north central region, near the capital of Kyiv, which is probably the central struggle, because that's where Zelensky is, that's where the government is, and a huge column of Russian armored vehicles are moving towards Kyiv as we speak, sort of tightening the ring around the capital. And then in the northeast, there's Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, which has also been attacked, is now being shelled with artillery and encircled by Russian forces. And then in the south, there's been a breakout from Crimea with forces moving north and east, trying to isolate these cities along the Ukrainian coast and link up with the so-called separatist regions, the Donbass and Luhansk area in the east. So the war is barely even a week old now, so very, very early days. But the Russians are advancing on three broad fronts here, and things look grim for the Ukrainians. They look much better than anyone anticipated, certainly better than Putin anticipated, and really better than many others anticipated. And we've seen an enormous rallying of the Ukrainian resistance, people joining the military, people fighting the Russians in various ways, making good use of anti-tank weapons that are being supplied from abroad to attack Russian armored vehicles, and shooting down some Russian aircraft with shoulder-mounted anti-aircraft missiles. So the Ukrainians have been putting up a much better fight than anyone expected, and really Zelensky, the president, has been an inspirational leader, not just for Ukraine itself, but for the European Union. I think his personal role in lobbying the European Union and the European countries to provide military aid and to sanction Russia has been extremely important here. So that's been a big shock for Putin. Nonetheless, the balance of material capabilities certainly favors the Russians at this point. And if they continue to pour those resources in, it looks like they will probably, in the relatively near future, be able to at least isolate the major cities of Kyiv and Kharkiv, besiege them, if not take them all together. So the future may look grim, certainly for the Ukrainian government figures, including President Zelensky. Nonetheless, they're a long way from conquering the country and occupying it. And it's not at all clear that the forces they have at their disposal, even if they're all used, would be sufficient for that task against the determined resistance from the Ukrainian people. And so there's a danger that the war may eventually bog down, even if the Russians are able to capture the major cities, that there could be partisan warfare that stretches on for months potentially, or longer. I wanted to mention or touch upon one issue, which is the nuclear angle, which has been in the news a lot recently. So Russia kind of prominently said that it was putting its nuclear forces on higher alert, and this was taken as a nuclear threat towards the Western Europeans and the United States not to get involved in the conflict. It's important to note there's no physical signs of this actually happening yet. Normally, when you put nuclear forces on alert, that means you do something with them. Like, for instance, if you have mobile missiles, you take them out of their garrison and put them on trucks and start driving them around. or you start mating up warheads with missiles that they're going to be delivered on, or you start putting your submarines out to sea, something along those lines. And we haven't seen physical signs of that yet. So it's not clear what this actually means. It may be mostly rhetorical. But it certainly does raise the question, could there be a direct war between NATO and Russia? What would that look like? Could it even be a nuclear war? And there have been proposals that we establish a no-fly zone, kind of reaching back to what we did in Iraq against Saddam Hussein, what we did in other countries as well that we've intervened in. That's highly unlikely. The Biden administration, in my view, extremely correctly has ruled that out, because that would lead to a direct military confrontation between NATO air forces and the Russian Air Force. So that would be essentially a declaration of war. I think a much more likely scenario is that the war does bog down, even if the Russians manage to capture big cities. The war bogs down into some sort of war of attrition, some sort of partisan warfare in the countryside. The West continues to help Ukrainians, sending them anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, ammunition over the border from Poland or the other NATO countries. Russia gets really mad about that, because that's taking a heavy toll on their forces, and they start making nuclear threats. And then the West says, well, we don't believe you're actually going to use nuclear weapons across our border, because that would invoke Article 5 and lead us to retaliate against you with nuclear weapons. That would be, in my view, that's not a terribly unlikely scenario. But I think the West, in some ways, would have reason on its side in calling that bluff, because historically speaking, if you look at the Cold War, insurgencies have fought nuclear-armed powers to a standstill and even inflicted defeats on them in Vietnam and in Afghanistan twice, once against the Russians, once against us. And those countries have never even really considered seriously using nuclear weapons against the states that were helping those insurgencies. In this case, that would be Russia threatening to use nuclear weapons against, say, Poland for helping an insurgency in Ukraine. Those threats have rarely been made and have never been taken seriously. On the other hand, this could be different, right? Putin has clearly shown himself to be a very risk-acceptant leader in this context, and so possibly that threat should be taken more seriously. But anyway, that's the scenario that I see that's the most likely to lead to direct confrontation between NATO forces and Russia. And finally, I don't have a slide on this, but I'll say one more thing on negotiations. There were negotiations, I believe, yesterday between Ukrainian representatives and Russian representatives, which didn't produce any agreement, which I think is highly unlikely at this early stage in the war. But they did agree to meet again, and so there may be further negotiations. My sense at this point is that both sides are going to keep fighting for a while until the battlefield produces a more decisive outcome. I think the Russians are surprised and shocked at how badly the war has been going for them, but it's only been a week. I mean, it took the Germans 6 weeks to conquer France, and that was considered a very quick victory. So it's still early days in this war, right? 2 weeks from now, the main cities of Ukraine could have fallen, and we could be facing a very different picture. On the other hand, they might not, and the Russians might be suffering even greater casualties and be contemplating withdrawing. And then there's the whole domestic politics side, right? How secure is Putin's rule in Russia? Could there be a possible coup against him, which would change the situation dramatically again? And with that, I will hand off to Professor Weeks, who will cover those issues in more detail.
Thank you, Professor Kydd. We'll be back to you with questions shortly. As noted, our final guest tonight is Professor Jessica Weeks, the H. Douglas Weaver Chair in Diplomacy and International Relations. Her research interests include foreign policy, non-democracy, peace, political institutions, public opinion, weapons of mass destruction, and the domestic and international politics of authoritarian regimes. Her 2014 book, Dictators at War and Peace, explores the domestic politics of international conflict in dictatorships, and was published in the Cornell Studies in Security Affairs series at Cornell University Press. Weeks is the 2018 recipient of the International Studies Association Karl Deutsch Award, recognizing the scholar under 40 who's made the most significant contribution to the study of international relations. So Professor Weeks, you're our cleanup hitter tonight before we go to questions. So the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. Hello, everybody, and it's really an honor to be here. I think Professors Herrera and Kydd have given us an extremely helpful overview of how we've gotten here. So I'm going to round out their contributions by digging into this from the angle of one of my own areas of expertise, namely the link between domestic politics and decisions about military conflict. So basically asking, how do the domestic politics help us understand both the current international situation and also perhaps help us understand where we might be headed? So to keep things short, I'll focus on Russia, but I could speak about some other places if that comes up in the Q&A. So first, I think it's important to understand some basics about Putin's regime. So obviously, Putin's system is a non-democracy, right? It's widely recognized that the elections are sham elections. So the public has little direct influence. The parliament is rigged, essentially. So these institutions have little direct influence, although I will talk a bit later about the threat of a public rebellion. So I'll come back to that later. But there are lots of different kinds of dictatorships. Most political scientists agree that Putin's regime has become what we call a personalist regime. And that's a regime where power is highly concentrated in the individual leader. Some other historical examples have been Iraq under Saddam Hussein or previous leaders in the area. So, for example, the Soviet Union under Stalin. And in these personalist regimes, the leader personally chooses who holds important positions within the regime and creates a system where those, what we can call regime insiders, depend on the leader entirely for their welfare. So if the regime falls, the people making the regime function really have nowhere to go, and that's by design. But what that means is that they have basically no incentives to criticize the leader, whether it's about domestic policy or about foreign policy, like decisions about war. And so this fits our sort of stereotypical notion of a dictatorship, but it's important to note that there are also other kinds of non-democracies with much more power sharing at high levels, including some previous eras in the former Soviet Union, where we might not be as worried as I think we need to be given the personalistic nature of Putin's regime. So the fact that Putin is now considered to be a consolidated personalist leader, I think can shed some light on what's happening right now. We obviously can't look inside Putin's mind right now. I mean, there's lots of interesting attempts to do so, but we obviously can't. But what we can do is look at historically similar kinds of dictatorships and try to learn from the patterns that we observed there. So what does the history tell us? So the first thing is that the kinds of leaders that come to power in these personalistic systems are often highly ambitious. Historically, many personalist dictators have explicitly wanted to create regional empires. Saddam Hussein, who I mentioned before, is an example. He wanted to dominate not just Iraq, but to be leader of the Arab world. And there's been a lot of chatter about whether Putin wants to recreate some version of either the Russian or the Soviet Empire. And I would argue that based on historical patterns of other personalist leaders in this past, this would unfortunately fit that pattern. Second, the lack of domestic constraints on Putin make it much easier for him to take big risks in military conflict. As I mentioned, there are really no direct checks on Putin, either from people inside the regime or the public, and that gives him much greater leeway, which is also incidentally exacerbated by Russia's oil wealth, which lets him buy off opponents and sort of keep this whole system afloat. So my own analysis of personalist dictatorships during the 20th century found that they've initiated more than 3 times as much conflict as other kinds of regimes, even some other kinds of non-democracies. So this is a very conflict-prone type of dictatorship. Now, obviously, in this case, the conflict initiation part has already happened, but this fundamental structure that I'm describing means that Putin can afford to take a lot of risk and bear a lot of costs going forward. And this obviously makes it very difficult for the West to deter him. Third, these kinds of leaders create very insulated decision making, which can lead to significant mistakes. So these personalist leaders tend to exclude elites and domestic experts from genuine input into the foreign policy process. We saw the photo that Professor Herrera shared. There are other photos similarly where you can really see the separation between Putin and any kind of advising or feedback. Another thing that happens is that these personalist leaders often simply just cannot help themselves from punishing people who disagree with them or give them news that they don't want to hear. And so, what this means is that they make decisions in a very closed way with restricted information and restricted feedback. And this seems to be the case with Putin as well. So, for example, after a recent meeting, Emmanuel Macron of France said that Putin is very isolated and acting very strangely. Now, it seems that some of this might have been exacerbated by COVID, but some of it is about how personalist regimes work. And the bottom line is that Putin doesn't have a strong group of advisors that have incentives to give him good, honest information or analysis, which can lead to overconfidence about things like Russia's military capabilities, the likely reactions of other countries, et cetera. And so, what we've observed historically is that this kind of a system can lead to very serious mistakes of different kinds. So, again, leaning on my own research, I found that personalist dictators lose wars at a very high rate, about 63% of the wars that they've been involved in. And that's nearly 3 times the rate of defeat of other kinds of political systems, including some other kinds of dictatorships. So, this isn't just a dictatorship thing, it's a personalist dictatorship problem. And so, you might think that this sounds like good news for the West, the fact that maybe Putin has miscalculated, but it also obviously raises the possibility that Putin will make mistakes going forward that cost Ukrainian lives, that lead to costly blunders of the kind that we've read about in the news, or at the absolute worst, even results in some kind of nuclear escalation. So I think that these are real concerns. And I'll come back to the possibility for more serious escalation in a moment. Another problem with bringing conflicts to a close with these kinds of dictators is that it's very difficult to reach credible, workable agreements with them. So, for example, if Putin makes a promise to the West for some sort of settlement, there's no one at home to punish him or hold him accountable if he goes back on his words. And again, that's different from certainly democracies, but even from other kinds of dictatorships. And it makes negotiating a peace agreement as a way to end the war very challenging. How would you believe that Putin will abide by any agreement? You'd need to build in a lot of monitoring capacity. So this building any kind of agreement that could work, I think, is a real challenge. So far, I've painted Putin as highly insulated, but of course, it's important to note that he is not all powerful. All authoritarian leaders, Putin included, do ultimately have to maintain the acceptance of ordinary citizens, right? So if the Russian public turned out in the streets in huge numbers, we could see a revolution. It's happened before. We saw it in 2011 during the Arab Spring, but we also saw it more recently in Ukraine, as Professor Herrera mentioned. So dictators of all different kinds have 2 basic strategies for keeping the public compliant. They can foster legitimacy and they can foster fear. The legitimacy side is basically making yourself popular. And for a long time, Putin actually did a pretty good job at that through things like providing economic growth, but also using media censorship to craft a certain image of how the regime was doing and his personal qualities, all of these things. But so far, the evidence is looking like the Russian public does not like this war. And I think that could be a problem for Putin. So Russia's population is interesting among non-democracies in that it's more educated and wealthier than many non-democracies. Moreover, Putin doesn't have quite the censorship abilities of other authoritarian regimes, right? So think about China has its famous Great Firewall, all of its own social media companies that the government can control. But most Russian cell phones have Western owned social media on them, and a lot of information flows through those channels. So it's quite difficult for Putin to shut off information flows and persuade Russians that the war is going well and keep them on his side. I mean, he's certainly trying, for example, slowing down Facebook, implementing all these new laws to try to get Western companies to censor content, but it's actually pretty hard to do. So all this raises the question of how the Russian public is reacting to the war. And as I mentioned, early signs suggest that they're not very enthusiastic. And there have even been protests, which says a lot in Russia right now, given the level of repression there. Also, this has sort of transcended foreign policy at this point, right? With the ruble tanking and the economy in free fall because of sanctions, people are feeling the war not just as some abstract concept, they're feeling it in their pocketbooks. And so Putin can try to use fear and repression to stop these protests, but that's also difficult to sustain for a long time. So I think that if things continue to go badly for Russia, sort of along the lines of what Professor Kydd was saying, it's possible that things could spiral out of control. So while this might sound good, it also, right, from the sense of we don't like this regime, it also involves some real dangers, I think, on the foreign policy side. And so this leads to my last point. I'll wrap up here. So the risk of a public revolution or the regime falling creates a potentially very worrying dynamic. Political scientists have talked about something called the gamble for resurrection. And this is when leaders who face a relatively certain threat of severe punishment, for example, because they think they're losing a war, and they think they're about to lose power, and they think that the consequences of losing power are extreme, which I think they would be for Putin. When leaders fear that, they're more likely to take big gambles to try to pull that rabbit out of the hat, pull off that victory and avoid that punishment. They think that since they don't have anything to lose, their best move is actually to escalate more rather than withdraw, right? So think about this from Putin's standpoint. He sees the war going badly. If it starts to really look like he's going to lose power, what happens to him? Historically, leaders like him have often faced very serious fates like imprisonment or even worse. So I think this does raise a real fear that if things don't go Putin's way, and if we see things escalate domestically in Russia, there's a chance that there could be even more severe escalation. So that's something that has been worrying some political scientists, including me. So I'll wrap up here. There's so much to talk about, but I'm sure that we will cover a bunch more ground in the Q&A.
Yes, we will. It's a very active chat tonight. I'm sure our team is trying to filter through it, but I'll start out by asking, have NATO and the United States done enough to help Ukraine, in your opinion, to this point in the conflict?
Mm-hmm.
Andrew.
In my opinion, yes, they've done a pretty good job of it in the sense that they're offering, a lot of NATO countries are offering sophisticated anti-tank weapons, anti-vehicle weapons, and anti-aircraft, man-powered or man-carried anti-aircraft systems, which have enabled the Ukrainians to shoot down some Russian helicopters and destroy some Russian armored vehicles. And that's really the key, right? If you could destroy their armored vehicles and the artillery pieces, you'd go a long way towards making it very difficult for the Russians to inflict the kind of devastation on Ukrainian cities that they did in the Chechen War against Grozny, for instance, the capital of Chechnya, and would turn it into an infantry war. And there, the disparity of motivation between the Russians and the Ukrainians would be glaringly apparent, I think. The Ukrainians are fighting for their country, and the Russians are not sure what they're fighting for. So that would really level the playing field. And to go further, I think, would be a huge mistake, right? To actually get involved directly would, for one thing, be playing into Russian propaganda, because then it would be NATO versus Russia rather than Ukraine versus Russia. So you want to keep it clear that it's Ukraine versus Russia. And as well, run the risk of broader escalation, including the possibility of nuclear war. So I think you want to aid them as much as you can, but not get directly involved. And I think that's exactly the policy that Biden is pursuing at this point. And not just Biden, I mean, with the other countries as well. Poland, Romania, even countries like Finland and Sweden, which are historically neutral, not NATO members at all, have been sending lethal aid to Ukraine, which is a big step on their part, and one that is got to be highly irritating to the Russians.
But can I just add? I think I don't disagree necessarily with the overall policy, but I think from a humanitarian perspective, just from a human perspective, it's just sickening to see this unfolding in slow motion before our eyes. And so I think even though Putin is such a dangerous character that we can't take any retaliatory action by him off the table. And so that's why NATO has to act so carefully. It's also just literally heartbreaking to see the Russian military moving in inch by inch and killing civilians. So, I mean, yes, maybe it's the right policy by NATO, but it's a horrible situation that Putin has brought us to.
Did the West understand that Zelensky was such a capable and charismatic leader? And why wasn't our relationship stronger sooner with him?
Well, he was a TV comedian. He's a winner of dancing contests. I mean, I don't think you could say, well, with that kind of resume, why didn't you expect that during a time of war he would step up? I think that people are judged by how they behave in difficult circumstances, not in easy circumstances. And so I think he's surprised. I mean, maybe his family and best friends already knew this about him, but I think many people have been surprised at his bravery and what he's done for the country in a very, very difficult time. And he is absolutely targeted by the Putin regime. So I think you're probably right that people didn't necessarily expect to have the highest expectations, but he's more than met them. But back to why didn't we have a stronger relationship? Why isn't Ukraine in NATO, et cetera? I mean, this is a longer discussion about other priorities that the United States has had over the last 20 years during Putin's reign, including the post 9/11 global war on terrorism, which took up a lot of our time during critical time and energy and attention during a critical time when Putin was building his power base.
I think it's also important to keep in mind the corruption and challenges with democracy that the regime has faced, which has been part of the reason that there hasn't been a stronger relationship in the past, from my opinion.
Question from the audience from MS Putnam. How does Putin's concern about NATO expansion into the Ukraine differ from the US concern about the Soviets putting missiles in Cuba? And Andrew, yes, I think.
Sure. Yeah, you see this brought up, and sometimes it's framed as, aren't Americans hypocritical because we think that Russia should not object to Ukraine being in NATO, but we would object if Mexico decided to form an alliance with China. So I guess my reaction to that is okay, but the important thing is for us as individuals or analysts or observers to be not hypocritical and to, and in that sense, right, you either support the free choice of weak states next to strong ones to chart their own course, or you don't. And if you do, you should support Ukraine against Russia, and maybe you should support Mexico's freedom to have an alliance with China if they want to. And maybe you should support the Castro government's, ability to ally with the Soviet Union if you want. And if you don't, then you can oppose all those things. But pointing out that the United States is happy when, Ukraine is not dominated by Russia, but unhappy when Mexico is like friendly with China, isn't itself a consistent position, right? I think we need to choose ourselves and have a consistent position on that. And I think that's why that's one reason why people look at this and find it very easy to sort of side with the Ukrainians in this story, right? It's clear that they are being invaded by a neighbor that denies their right to exist. And I think it's also clear that this isn't, although Putin likes to talk about Nazis and whatnot running the Ukrainian government, but this isn't about regime change. The goal here is not to establish a friendly government in Ukraine. I think the goal is to annex Ukraine, is to make Ukraine part of Russia. So that's a different thing than U.S. policy towards Cuba. And I mean, it's fine to not like U.S. policy towards Cuba. You can think the embargo has lasted far too long. It's crazy. But that doesn't mean that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is good or acceptable.
May I just add to Andy's point that, so I use the analogy of Cuba in my class that I'm teaching this semester to help students understand some of Russia's motivation. And I think many analysts of international relations would say that it's very typical for countries to object to not having buffers and to having what they perceive, rightly or wrongly, as enemies right across the border. So I do think that the analogy is helpful in the sense that it reminds people in the West that there is an element here of needing to take some of Russia's security concerns seriously. So I'm not saying that I think Russia has said many things that are just wild fabrications, but any kind of agreement needs to recognize that historically powerful countries have not been comfortable with perceived enemies right at their borders. And so that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and actually, I just want to add that this question of is it NATO's fault? Is NATO expansion the problem? I mean, lots and lots of scholars have weighed in on this, but I just want to note that we could have had this discussion up until 10 days ago, and I would have been willing to give a lot of space to thinking about different things that happened in the last 20 years. But there were so many off-ramps, so many diplomatic options. Russia could have very easily declared victory 10 days ago and said, look, I got everybody to listen to our concerns. Every European leader, the US, NATO, et cetera, they're all taking us seriously on the issue of NATO expansion. And they could have come to some kind of conclusion that would have resulted in addressing any legitimate security concerns that Russia had. But all of that sort of changed with the invasion because Putin put every historical discussion aside and just said, I could go home, we could have peace, we could talk things out the way that countries with grievances do, or I could just wage this war unprovoked. And so I feel like it's a little bit irritating to have the historical discussion at this moment because that is one of the distractions that Putin would like us to have that takes away from noticing his actions.
I'm going to modify a question from Wei Zhang, who asks, which international leaders are most likely to persuade Putin to get out of this war or end the war? And I'll also add, or might it be some domestic figure in Russia, who would have the best chance to change Putin's mind about what he's doing right now?
He's very isolated. People in Russia are saying that even in 2014, there were lots of people in Moscow who could say, I know somebody who talks to him regularly. And there's very few people that anybody thinks right now have his ear. His chief of staff even is sidelined with COVID. So he is very, very isolated. In terms of, so some of the oligarchs, et cetera, either have kept silent or have kind of off the record said that they're very upset about this, but they haven't said anything directly. So it's not clear domestically who he's listening to, although he has to be worried. I mean, taking off this radio station and TV station today off the air is a sign of his concern. But I would say in terms of other world leaders, possibly his fellow authoritarian buddy, Xi Jinping in China, is somebody you will listen to because China's position on the sanctions is going to be important. Possibly in the Emirates, it's another country that could possibly help him out. But I would be surprised if China and the Emirates didn't take a wait and see stance and see which way the wind was blowing and perhaps decide to go along with the sanctions, given their other global market interests.
I agree with everything Yoe just said about the international pressures. Yoe, I'm wondering, do you see any movement from the internal security forces? Do you think if there were some unified response there, do you think there's any chance that could persuade Putin?
Well, I think what people are wondering about is what if Putin does something even crazier related to nuclear weapons or something like that. That is, another level of unprovoked disaster. So that's where I think some people are wondering, well, what are the constraints on him? How far is the military willing to go? I think some people are hopeful that there would be some break in the elites or a coup, that the crashing of the ruble and the ruination of the economy is going to do something. But unfortunately, he has such a tight rein. He has been so successful in cutting out any potential opponent, and using violence against the population internally, that people are still very quiet with their, the elite are very quiet with their criticism. So I think it's kind of early to tell, but that could be one source if he decides to undertake a, just massively more violent campaign in Ukraine.
I guess I keep hoping someone will offer him a 20-year super yacht vacation. That would sure be nice.
Well, don't forget, Idi Amin died in Saudi Arabia in 2003, 24 years after he left power. So these things can happen. Leaders can get golden parachutes, but it requires a country that basically doesn't care about international law and is willing to host them, despite the fact that there's a price on their head. China would be the likely candidate there, but that would be the only one. I mean, I think the hopeful possibility here, not that it's necessarily likely, but the one possible hopeful scenario here is that Putin leaves power as a result of this, that this is just a bridge too far, that somehow he has taken the country in such a disastrous path that someone plucks up the courage in the military, in the security services, and stages some sort of coup and either forces him into exile or actually assassinates him. And so there's a regime transition of some sort in Russia. And I think that becomes especially acute if the war does bog down. Seems like it's going to last. Seems like the Western resolve is holding. The Russian economy keeps on declining. And Putin starts making nuclear threats. At that point, I think you either get nuclear war or you get Putin overthrown. So it's either disaster or it's a new day.
To me, that also raises...
Oh, sorry.
I was just... to me, that raises the question then, though, of what comes next. I don't know if that there's a very clear picture of what kind of regime would succeed or who would succeed Putin. And that worries me a bit too.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the causes or potential causes of the situation that we haven't talked about, but I've heard other people comment on, is that, the United States and some of the West is simply too divided and weak to support Russia's neighbors. And so this was an easy mark for Putin. What are your thoughts about that? Is there any reason to be optimistic, or how do you feel about people who take that position?
I think he thought that, and he was wrong. I think there's been an unprecedented show of support in the sanctions. I think that people are going to be studying these sanctions, the severity of them, the complexity and comprehensiveness of these sanctions for some time to come. So I think the connection between Europe and the US has never been stronger. The connections within the European Union and even countries that are not part of the European Union, like the UK, the closeness with which Europe is acting on this is astounding and good. And I would also say that I think in the United States there is emerging consensus against Putin. There's still some disagreements on how to handle him, but I think that we are very quickly moving to a bipartisan condemnation of his regime and his actions.
I would agree with that. A couple things to add. I think also movements we've seen, such as Germany increasing its defense spending, are really developments that are not to be understated. So I agree, Putin thought the West would be divided, and the response has been beyond what he would have expected. I think on the US side, I'm cautiously optimistic that despite the current climate of polarization, this is an issue that Americans seem to agree on. So polls are starting to come out since the invasion, and they show that both Democrats and Republicans, majorities of them, support sanctions, even if they're costly. We're not seeing a huge partisan split on that issue. That would worry me, but we're not seeing it. We're seeing, of course, some criticism of the Biden administration, casting blame for how we got to the situation. But then typically in the same sentence, we're also seeing, but ultimately the fault lies with Putin. So that's also heartening. I think the one area where there is some, not the one, but one area where there's some potential for a split is on the relationship with NATO, because looking at polling data, that's an area where there's due to the last 6 years or so of rhetoric, there is a partisan split, with Democrats much more optimistic and supportive of NATO, and Republicans more critical. So to the extent that burden sharing issues continue to be an issue, I do think that could be an area of tension domestically, but overall cautiously optimistic.
Andrew, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it has been unifying. I think that Putin thought that the West was in decline, on the ropes, hopelessly split along partisan lines, polarized, and this has been a rallying cry, both in Europe, within countries in Europe, among the European countries, and between the United States and Europe, and within the United States, so across the board. That's great. And some of the voices, most prominent voices in the United States who were supportive of Putin, and were even supportive of Putin at the outset of the war, most notably, of course, former President Trump, his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, have sort of seen the unpopularity of that position and have backtracked a bit from it. As you see so many Republicans, both in public opinion polls and in terms of elected officials, criticizing Russia and supporting Ukraine for the war. So, knock on wood, wish that could last. We'll see how much of an effect that has, but that's been a real, a very good thing to see, that sort of level of unity.
Well, I'm going to stop there on a note of cautious optimism that you all left us with. These are very difficult times, and I really thank you all for taking the time to speak with alumni tonight about your perspectives on this. All between you, I know there's a lot of years of analysis that's gone into your summary observations tonight. So thank you for sharing them.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
And I want to thank all of you for joining us for a pretty sobering discussion tonight. The UW Now live stream will be back with a special edition live from Arizona on Saturday, March 12th. I hope you'll join me for the conversation on baseball and big data. We'll feature Bud Selig, the former commissioner of Major League Baseball, Lou Wolf, former owner of the Oakland A's, and UW's own Laura Albert, author of the blog Badger Bracketology. So baseball and big data coming your way soon. How about we go win a Big Ten championship tonight? On Wisconsin.
You can try, but you'll never stop a Badger. Because we Badgers are born with curious minds and endless heart. When we see a curve in the road, we speed up. When there are mask shortages for first responders, we make our own supply chain. When there's a world on pause, we sharpen our claws. Through thunder, fire, and pandemics, we'll keep going. Because after all, you can't stop a Badger.